History and Nature. Voyages. Between 1492 and 1504, Columbus completed 4 round-trip voyages between Spain and the Americas, each voyage being sponsored by the Crown of Castile. On his first voyage he reached the Americas, initiating the European exploration and colonization of the continent, as well as the Columbian Exchange. His role in history is thus important to the Age of Discovery, Western history, and human history writ large. In Columbus's letter on the first voyage, published following his first return to Spain, he claimed that he had reached Asia, as previously described by Marco Polo and other Europeans. Over his subsequent voyages, Columbus refused to acknowledge that the lands he visited and claimed for Spain were not part of Asia, in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. This might explain, in part, why the American continent was named after the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who received credit for recognizing it as a new world, and not after Columbus. First voyage, 1492 to 1493. On the evening of August 3, 1492, Columbus departed from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships. The largest was a carrack, the Santa Maria, owned and captained by Juan de la Cosa, and under Columbus's direct command. The other 2 were smaller caravels, the Pinta and the Nina, 96, piloted by the Pinzon brothers. Columbus first sailed to the Canary Islands. There he restocked provisions and made repairs, then departed from San Sebastián de la Gomera on September 6, for what turned out to be a 5-week voyage across the ocean. On October 7, the crew spotted immense flocks of birds. 98. On October 11, Columbus changed the fleet's course to due west and sailed through the night, believing land was soon to be found. At around 2 o'clock the following morning, a lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, spotted land. The captain of the Pinta, Martín Alonso Pinzón, verified the sight of land and alerted Columbus. Columbus later maintained that he had already seen a light on the land a few hours earlier, thereby claiming for himself the lifetime pension promised by Ferdinand and Isabella to the first person to sight land. Columbus called this island, in what is now the Bahamas, San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior. The natives called it Guanahani. Christopher Columbus's journal entry of October 12, 1492 states, "I saw some who had marks of wounds on their bodies and I made signs to them asking what they were. And they showed me how people from other islands nearby came there and tried to take them, and how they defended themselves, and I believed and believe that they come here from Tierra Firme to take them captive. They should be good and intelligent servants, for I see that they say very quickly everything that is said to them, and I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Our Lord pleasing, at the time of my departure I will take 6 of them from here to your highnesses in order that they may learn to speak." Columbus called the inhabitants of the lands that he visited Los Indios, Spanish for Indians. He initially encountered the Lucayan, Taino, and Arawak peoples. Noting their gold ear ornaments, Columbus took some of the Arawaks prisoner and insisted that they guide him to the source of the gold. Columbus did not believe he needed to create a fortified outpost, writing, "The people here are simple in warlike matters. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men, and govern them as I pleased." The Tainos told Columbus that another indigenous tribe, Caribs, were fierce warriors and cannibals, who made frequent raids on the Tainos, often capturing their women. Columbus also explored the northeast coast of Cuba, where he landed on October 28. On the night of November 26, Martín Alonso Pinzón took the Pinta on an unauthorized expedition in search of an island called Babe Cay or Bain Cay, which the natives had told him was rich in gold. Columbus, for his part, continued to the northern coast of Hispaniola, where he landed on December 6. There, the Santa Maria ran aground on December 25, 1492, and had to be abandoned. The wreck was used as a target for cannon fire to impress the native peoples. Columbus was received by the native cacique Guacanagari, who gave him permission to leave some of his men behind. Columbus left 39 men, including the interpreter Luis de Torres, and founded the settlement of La Navidad, in present-day Haiti. Columbus took more natives prisoner and continued his exploration. 107. He kept sailing along the northern coast of Hispaniola with a single ship until he encountered Pinzon and the Pinta on January 6. On January 13, 1493, Columbus made his last stop of this voyage in the Americas, in the Bay of Rinson in northeast Hispaniola. There he encountered the Saguayos, the only natives who offered violent resistance during this voyage. The Saguayos refused to trade the amount of bows and arrows that Columbus desired. In the ensuing clash, one Saguayo was stabbed in the buttocks and another wounded with an arrow in his chest. Because of these events, Columbus called the inlet the Golfo de los Fleches, Bay of Arrows. Columbus headed for Spain on the Nina, but a storm separated him from the Pinta, and forced the Nina to stop at the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. Half of his crew went ashore to say prayers of thanksgiving in a chapel for having survived the storm. But while praying, they were imprisoned by the governor of the island, ostensibly on suspicion of being pirates. After a 2-day standoff, the prisoners were released, and Columbus again set sail for Spain. Another storm forced Columbus into the port at Lisbon. From there he went to Vale do Paraíso north of Lisbon to meet King John II of Portugal, who told Columbus that he believed the voyage to be in violation of the 1479 Treaty of Alcacovas. After spending more than a week in Portugal, Columbus set sail for Spain. Returning to Palos on March 15, 1493, he was given a hero's welcome and soon afterward received by Isabella and Ferdinand in Barcelona. Columbus's letter on the first voyage, dispatched to the Spanish court, was instrumental in spreading the news throughout Europe about his voyage. Almost immediately after his arrival in Spain, printed versions began to appear, and word of his voyage spread rapidly. Most people initially believed that he had reached Asia. 89. The Bulls of Donation, 3 papal bulls of Pope Alexander VI delivered in 1493, purported to grant overseas territories to Portugal and the Catholic monarchs of Spain. They were replaced by the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. The 2 earliest published copies of Columbus's letter on the first voyage aboard the Nina were donated in 2017 by the J.I. Kislak Foundation to the University of Miami Library in Coral Gables, Florida, where they are housed. 12. Second voyage, 1493 to 1496. On September 24, 1493, Columbus sailed from Cadiz with 17 ships and supplies to establish permanent colonies in the Americas. He sailed with nearly 1,500 men, including sailors, soldiers, priests, carpenters, stonemasons, metalworkers, and farmers. Among the expedition members were Alvarez Chenca, a physician who wrote a detailed account of the second voyage, Juan Ponce de Leon, the first governor of Puerto Rico and Florida, the father of Bartolomé de las Casas, Juan de la Cosa, a cartographer who is credited with making the first world map depicting the New World, and Columbus's youngest brother Diego. The fleet stopped at the Canary Islands to take on more supplies, and set sail again on October 7, deliberately taking a more southerly course than on the first voyage. On November 3, they arrived in the Windward Islands. The first island they encountered was named Dominica by Columbus, but not finding a good harbor there, they anchored off a nearby smaller island, which he named Marie-Galante, now a part of Guadeloupe and called Marie-Galante. Other islands named by Columbus on this voyage were Montserrat, Antigua, St. Martin, the Virgin Islands, as well as many others. On November 22, Columbus returned to Hispaniola to visit La Navidad, where 39 Spaniards had been left during the first voyage. Columbus found the fort in ruins, destroyed by the Tainos after some of the Spaniards reportedly antagonized their hosts with their unrestrained lust for gold and women. Columbus then established a poorly located and short-lived settlement to the east, La Isabela, in the present-day Dominican Republic. From April to August 1494, Columbus explored Cuba and Jamaica, then returned to Hispaniola. By the end of 1494, disease and famine had killed 2/3 of the Spanish settlers. Columbus implemented encomienda, a Spanish labor system that rewarded conquerors with the labor of conquered non-Christian people. Columbus executed Spanish colonists for minor crimes, and used dismemberment as punishment. Columbus and the colonists enslaved the indigenous people, including children. Natives were beaten, raped, and tortured for the location of imagined gold. Thousands committed suicide rather than face the oppression. In February 1495, Columbus rounded up about 1,500 Arawaks, some of whom had rebelled, in a great slave raid. About 500 of the strongest were shipped to Spain as slaves, with about 200 of those dying en route. In June 1495, the Spanish crown sent ships and supplies to Hispaniola. In October, Florentine merchant Gianotto Berardi, who had won the contract to provision the fleet of Columbus's second voyage and to supply the colony on Hispaniola, received almost 40,000 maravedis worth of enslaved Indians. History and nature. He renewed his effort to get supplies to Columbus, and was working to organize a fleet when he suddenly died in December. On March 10, 1496, having been away about 30 months, the fleet departed La Isabela. On June 8 the crew sighted land somewhere between Lisbon and Cape St. Vincent, and disembarked in Cadiz on June 11. Third voyage, 1498 to 1500. On May 30, 1498, Columbus left with 6 ships from Sanlúcar, Spain. The fleet called at Madeira and the Canary Islands, where it divided in two, with 3 ships heading for Hispaniola and the other 3 vessels, commanded by Columbus, sailing south to the Cape Verde Islands and then westward across the Atlantic. It is probable that this expedition was intended at least partly to confirm rumors of a large continent south of the Caribbean Sea, that is, South America. On July 31 they sighted Trinidad, 149, the most southerly of the Caribbean islands. On August 5, Columbus sent several small boats ashore on the southern side of the Paria Peninsula in what is now Venezuela, near the mouth of the Orinoco River. This was the first recorded landing of Europeans on the mainland of South America, which Columbus realized must be a continent. The fleet then sailed to the islands of Xicaxicar and Margarita, reaching the latter on August 14, and sighted Tobago and Grenada from afar, according to some scholars. On August 19, Columbus returned to Hispaniola. There he found settlers in rebellion against his rule, and his unfulfilled promises of riches. Columbus had some of the Europeans tried for their disobedience. At least one rebel leader was hanged. In October 1499, Columbus sent 2 ships to Spain, asking the court of Spain to appoint a royal commissioner to help him govern. By this time, accusations of tyranny and incompetence on the part of Columbus had also reached the court. The sovereigns sent Francisco de Bobadilla, a relative of Marquesa Beatriz de Bobadilla, a patron of Columbus and a close friend of Queen Isabella, to investigate the accusations of brutality made against the admiral. Arriving in Santo Domingo while Columbus was away, Bobadilla was immediately met with complaints about all 3 Columbus brothers. He moved into Columbus's house and seized his property, took depositions from the admiral's enemies, and declared himself governor. Bobadilla reported to Spain that Columbus once punished a man found guilty of stealing corn by having his ears and nose cut off and then selling him into slavery. He claimed that Columbus regularly used torture and mutilation to govern Hispaniola. Testimony recorded in the report stated that Columbus congratulated his brother Bartholomew on defending the family when the latter ordered a woman paraded naked through the streets and then had her tongue cut because she had spoken ill of the admiral and his brothers. The document also describes how Columbus put down native unrest and revolt. He first ordered a brutal suppression of the uprising in which many natives were killed, and then paraded their dismembered bodies through the streets in an attempt to discourage further rebellion. Columbus vehemently denied the charges. The neutrality and accuracy of the accusations and investigations of Bobadilla toward Columbus and his brothers have been disputed by historians, given the anti-Italian sentiment of the Spaniards and Bobadilla's desire to take over Columbus's position. In early October 1500, Columbus and Diego presented themselves to Bobadilla, and were put in chains aboard La Gorda, the caravel on which Bobadilla had arrived at Santo Domingo. They were returned to Spain, and languished in jail for 6 weeks before King Ferdinand ordered their release. Not long after, the king and queen summoned the Columbus brothers to the Alhambra Palace in Granada. The sovereigns expressed indignation at Bobadilla's actions, who was then recalled and ordered to make restitutions of the property he had confiscated from Columbus. The royal couple heard the brothers' pleas, restored their freedom and wealth, and, after much persuasion, agreed to fund Columbus's fourth voyage. However, Nicolas de Ovando was to replace Bobadilla and be the new governor of the West Indies. New light was shed on the seizure of Columbus and his brother Bartholomew, the Adelantado, with the discovery by archivist Isabel Aguirre of an incomplete copy of the testimonies against them gathered by Francisco de Bobadilla at Santo Domingo in 1500. She found a manuscript copy of this pesquisa, inquiry, in the archive of Simancas, Spain, uncatalogued until she and Consuelo Varela published their book, La Queda de Cristobal Colón, El Juicio de Bobadilla, The Fall of Christopher Colón, The Judgment of Bobadilla, in 2006. Fourth Voyage, 1502 to 1504. On May 9, 1502, Columbus left Cadiz with his flagship Santa Maria and 3 other vessels. The ships were crewed by 140 men, including his brother Bartholomew as second in command and his son Fernando. He sailed to Arcila on the Moroccan coast to rescue Portuguese soldiers said to be besieged by the Moors. The siege had been lifted by the time they arrived, so the Spaniards stayed only a day and continued on to the Canary Islands. On June 15, the fleet arrived at Martinique, where it lingered for several days. A hurricane was forming, so Columbus continued westward, hoping to find shelter on Hispaniola. He arrived at Santo Domingo on June 29, but was denied port, and the new governor Francisco de Bobadilla refused to listen to his warning that a hurricane was approaching. Instead, while Columbus's ships sheltered at the mouth of the Rio Jaina, the first Spanish treasure fleet sailed into the hurricane. Columbus's ships survived with only minor damage, while 20 of the 30 ships in the governor's fleet were lost along with 500 lives, including that of Francisco de Bobadilla. Although a few surviving ships managed to straggle back to Santo Domingo, Aguja, the fragile ship carrying Columbus's personal belongings and his 4,000 pesos in gold was the sole vessel to reach Spain. The gold was his 10th decimo of the profits from Hispaniola, equal to 240,000 maravedis, guaranteed by the Catholic monarchs in 1492. After a brief stop at Jamaica, Columbus sailed to Central America, arriving at the coast of Honduras on July 30. Here Bartholomew found native merchants and a large canoe. On August 14, Columbus landed on the continental mainland at Punta Caxinas, now Puerto Castilla, Honduras. He spent 2 months exploring the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, seeking a strait in the western Caribbean through which he could sail to the Indian Ocean. Sailing south along the Nicaraguan coast, he found a channel that led into Almirante Bay in Panama on October 5. As soon as his ships anchored in Almirante Bay, Columbus encountered Ngade people in canoes who were wearing gold ornaments. In January 1503, he established a garrison at the mouth of the Belen River. Columbus left for Hispaniola on April 16. On May 10 he sighted the Cayman Islands, naming them Las Tortugas after the numerous sea turtles there. His ships sustained damage in a storm off the coast of Cuba. Unable to travel farther, on June 25, 1503 they were beached in Sainton Parish, Jamaica. For 6 months Columbus and 230 of his men remained stranded on Jamaica. Diego Méndez de Segura, who had shipped out as a personal secretary to Columbus, and a Spanish shipmate called Bartolomé Flisco, along with 6 natives, paddled a canoe to get help from Hispaniola. The governor, Nicolas de Ovando y Casares, detested Columbus and obstructed all efforts to rescue him and his men. In the meantime Columbus, in a desperate effort to induce the natives to continue provisioning him and his hungry men, won their favor by predicting a lunar eclipse for February 29, 1504, using Abraham Zacuto's astronomical charts. Despite the governor's obstruction, Christopher Columbus and his men were rescued on June 28, 1504, and arrived in Sanlúcar, Spain, on November 7. Later life, illness, and death. Columbus had always claimed that the conversion of non-believers was one reason for his explorations, and he grew increasingly religious in his later years. Probably with the assistance of his son Diego and his friend the Carthusian monk Gaspar Gariccio, Columbus produced 2 books during his later years: a Book of Privileges, 1502, detailing and documenting the rewards from the Spanish crown to which he believed he and his heirs were entitled, and a Book of Prophecies, 1505, in which passages from the Bible were used to place his achievements as an explorer in the context of Christian eschatology. In his later years, Columbus demanded that the Crown of Castile give him his tenth of all the riches and trade goods yielded by the new lands, as stipulated in the capitulations of Santa Fe. Because he had been relieved of his duties as governor, the crown did not feel bound by that contract and his demands were rejected. After his death, his heirs sued the crown for a part of the profits from trade with America, as well as other rewards. This led to a protracted series of legal disputes known as the Pleitos Colombinos, Colombian lawsuits. During a violent storm on his first return voyage, Columbus, then 41, had suffered an attack of what was believed at the time to be gout. In subsequent years, he was plagued with what was thought to be influenza and other fevers, bleeding from the eyes, temporary blindness, and prolonged attacks of gout. The attacks increased in duration and severity, sometimes leaving Columbus bedridden for months at a time, and culminated in his death 14 years later.